Invite your attention to the book of Job. Book of Job tonight. We'll begin there, and we'll be studying this book together tonight. Let me tell you how excited I am to be here and how thankful I am to be on this series. Good to hear Lee say that it's been a success thus far, as it has been in other years, and certainly I am thankful and honored to be included as part of this group here. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. Paul said, "Be imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ." And so I think that's been our theme, or it's been your theme up to this point, and we'll continue looking at being imitators of Job and his ability to endure suffering. And let me tell you again how much I appreciate being here, and we have begun the work there at Eastside beginning in January, and we're thankful to be a part of that group again. Back in 2008, my wife and I moved to Eastside, and we worked as the youth minister there for just a few years until the end of 2011 before we moved back to Alabama. And then this past January, moved back up here to fill the pulpit there. And so it's good to be back and see so many people that we remember. And some of them remember us. It's funny, we'll go and I'll see someone that I remember, and we'll talk to them. They say, it's good to see you. I don't remember you. And I'll say, well, I've had 4 children since then, and so I probably look a lot different than you recall that I looked. But whatever the case, we're glad to be back, and it's good to you can find your way around town, and some of the back roads I still remember, and though Cleveland has grown, it is good to see all of the people that we remember, good friends, and because my mother was a McCracken, maybe even family. We're not sure, but friends and family. But we're glad to be with God's people whenever we can. Thankful for this opportunity tonight. We're going to look at the idea of being imitators of Job and his ability to endure suffering. What do you think about when you think about the book of Job? We talk about the patience of Job, the New Testament says, Job being one who was patient. That doesn't mean he was able to sit around and wait for something to happen. It simply means that he was able to endure. He was able to get through suffering, make it through to the other side, and while he perhaps never really understood what happened, he was one who was willing and able to endure suffering. I think of suffering when I think about the book of Job, 42 chapters, 1,070 verses, dealing with man's oldest problem, and that is suffering. Sometimes it comes from sin, sometimes that doesn't. Job was a very blessed man, if you'll recall from your study of the book. There in the beginning, we see him as one of the greatest men in all of the East, wealthiest certainly. And he had a number of goods that he was able to, as we might say, coast through the rest of his life. He was, as you could be in those times, retired. He was ready to get to the end of his life. Yet, as he would say, trouble came. Difficulties came upon him that were not his fault. In fact, the troubles that came to him were the cause of not man, but rather Satan. You'll recall at the beginning that it says that when God was being presented by the sons of God, the angels there were coming before him, that Satan appeared. And God asked him a question, though he already knew the answer, but he asked Satan, "Where have you been? What are you doing here?" And Satan said, "Well, I've been in the earth. I've been going up and down, back and forth in the earth," really telling God, that's my territory. That's my place. You can have heaven and this footstool and this throne here, but that's the earth. That's my territory. I've been going up and down, to and fro, wherever I want to go in it. God said, "Have you considered my servant Job? Have you considered my servant Job? He eschews evil and he is upright." Satan made an accusation. We'll talk more about him later, but Satan made an accusation that Job the only reason he serves you is because you built a hedge around him. You protect him from all things that are bad. If you will take that wall away, if you'll allow him to suffer a little bit, he'll curse you to the face. Satan didn't know the heart of Job, but that was his idea. And so God gave Satan the ability and the authority to do whatever he wanted to Job, except don't touch him. And so Job's wealth was quickly taken away. Satan took away all of his animals, killed them, left all but one servant dead for each of those animals that he had. The servant would return and tell Job about the problem. "I was out there in the country and the enemy came and took all of your livestock, and I'm the only one that's left." So Job didn't have any money, didn't have any livestock. On one occasion, a servant came up to him and came running up and said, we were tending the animals, and the fire of God came down and devoured all of the livestock, and I'm the only one that's left to tell you. Here we have blamed on God the problems that Job endured. And then his 10 children were in the same house, and a whirlwind, tornado perhaps, sweeps through, destroys the house, and kills all 10 of them inside. Talk about suffering. Job lost everything, the most important of which was his children. They were all gone, seemingly in a moment. What does Job do? When he finishes that, whenever he hears the last of those things, Job bows down and worships God and says, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away." Now, there's a theme throughout Job that you'll see. When you read that book, you see that Job and his friends and others do not understand what's happening. They think God is giving him these blessings and then taking them away, even though he's not doing that. We might feel the same way today. You might have your insurance company has in there a little title for acts of God, some things that might happen weather-wise and things like that. Well, God's not really causing those things to happen directly any more than he was to Job. But Job didn't understand. But when he realizes that everything is gone, he bows down, he worships God. Even though he lost everything, he still was maintaining his integrity before God. And then Satan goes back to God. God said, "Have you considered my servant Job? He still eschews evil and he still is upright." And Satan said, "Of course he is. Of course he does those things because he's healthy." A man would get everything in his life for his own life. So if he starts to suffer physically himself, well, then he'll curse you to the face. And so then God gave Satan the authority to do anything he wanted to Job. Anything at all, except don't kill him. That's the only thing you can't do. Here's the line, Satan. You cannot go beyond that. So believe me when I tell you that Job suffered. He suffered terrible things. Boils and sores on his body from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. He suffered and could not sleep because of how much he was suffering, these boils and other things that were going on with him. When he finally falls asleep because of exhaustion, he is terrified by incredible nightmares that wake him up again. When his friends come to see him because they've heard of this calamity that's happened to him, they find him in a trash heap and he's taking potsherds and he is scraping his skin because it is the only way he can find to get any relief. Job is suffering. His friends come and they sit with him for 7 days. And they don't say a word. They don't say anything to him. In fact, it's probably likely that they didn't even believe it was him at first because his appearance was so different than probably the last time that they had seen him. But through all of this and through all of the rest of the book, Job is going to endure this suffering. And even though he doesn't know why it's happening, he still gets through it and, most importantly, remains faithful to God. He blames God, says, "Sure, God's doing this to me, but it's not because I've sinned. There's a test or there's something else that's here that I don't understand. And no matter what's going to happen to me, I'm going to remain faithful to God." We're going to be imitators of Job. We need to learn to be imitators of him even when we suffer, because suffering is something that happens to all of us. Whether we're currently suffering, we've just finished suffering, or we're about to suffer because of something else that might be happening to us. It may be something that we don't have anything to do with. Sometimes we suffer because of our choices. Sometimes we suffer because of other people's choices. Sometimes we suffer simply because we're human and things happen. Bad things happen to good people. And so rather than question God to the point where we say, "Well, if you're going to let this happen to me, then I'm not going to be faithful to you." Rather than question God to that point, we need to say that no matter what happens, I'm still going to maintain my integrity. I'm still going to maintain my faithfulness to him. But something interesting happens whenever we suffer. Because as we can point into Scripture and perhaps in our own lives, we're not special. God's people are certainly special to him, but we're not special in this world in that we don't ever suffer. In fact, God's people suffer as much, perhaps even more sometimes, than those in the world. But something happens when we suffer, and that is that we learn something about some groups of people. We're going to look at those during our time this evening. Whenever I suffer, as Job did, Job learned about certain people. And when you and I suffer and we endure the way that Job did, we learn about those same groups of people as well. So let's notice these groups. First of all, When Job suffered, he learned about his supporters. He learned about his friends. And unfortunately, he learned that he didn't have true friends on this earth. He learned that his friends were fair weather friends. He probably had a great amount of them while he was wealthy. He had a number of friends, perhaps, that were close to him whenever he had a lot of things. But then when everything was destroyed and everything was stolen, and he's now on the brink of death because of what's happening to him health-wise, he doesn't have any friends. Now, I mentioned those three. There are three that come and they sit there with him in that trash heap. And they don't speak for 7 days. For 1 week, they do not say a word. Some have posited that this is because Job is older than they are. And in that culture, you would wait for the oldest person to speak first, and then you could speak. Maybe that's the case. Maybe they didn't know what to say because Job's life was in shambles. His health, his wealth, his family, all gone. Whatever the case, though, they wait for Job to speak, and he tells them about how terrible his life has become and how he doesn't know why it's happening, but he's going to remain faithful to God. And then his friends make their first mistake. They came and they sat with him. That's great. Sometimes when we are suffering, the only thing we can really ask for is someone to sit with us. And that's what they did, and that was great. They sat with him, and then they made their first mistake, and that's they began to talk. They started talking, and they began to tell Job everything they thought was wrong. Let's go to Job 4, verses 7 through 8. Well, all three of them have the same idea about Job's suffering. But it's resolved here in Job 4, verses 7 and 8. Eliphaz is the one speaking here. Eliphaz says to Job, "Remember, I pray you, who ever perished being innocent? Or where were the righteous cut off? Even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap also the same." Here's their idea. Job, you are suffering terribly. And if we are faithful to God, we're not going to suffer. Therefore, because you're suffering, that means you're a terrible sinner. You're suffering more than anybody else. That means you are the greatest sinner in the world. And so you need to ask for forgiveness. You need to figure out a way to have these sins removed so that you can go back to being in God's good graces. Job would answer him as well as the other two. They had the same idea in mind. He would tell them, I'm not a sinner. I haven't done these things. Yes, I've made mistakes. Yes, I've done things that were wrong, but I'm not the greatest sinner in the world. I don't know why I'm suffering. God's doing this to me, Job thought, but I'm still going to maintain my faithfulness to him. Their conclusion was that, Job, you deserve this. You know, it might be that when we suffer, we want to look around for someone to blame. Who's at fault when this diagnosis comes in? Who's at fault when I lose my job? Who's at fault when bad things happen to good people? You know, sometimes there are people to blame. There are ones that we can point to or things that we've done that we could point to and say, that's why. But you know, there are other times when we suffer and there's no one to blame. Bad things happen to good people. Jesus talked about that. He said, you know, the Tower of Siloam fell on a certain number of people and killed them. Were they the greatest sinners? And he said, no. But I tell you, unless you repent of that thinking, you're also going to perish. Herod killed a number of people at the temple. Were they the greatest sinners that ever lived? And he said, I tell you, no. But except you repent, you're also going to perish in this way. See, sometimes bad things happen. And it's not good for us to constantly be on the lookout for who's to blame for my suffering. Maybe that's not the point. You see, Job could have tried to find who was at fault there. But his concern was not only the present, but also the future. What's going to happen to me in the future? I look at my past and I see what I've done and I see if I've caused my suffering. And if not, then I can only endure it and continue through it. But Job needed friends and he realized he didn't have any. They thought he was the greatest sinner that had ever lived. And even a fourth friend, Elihu, that comes up later, he also said that Job was a sinner. He actually said, Job, God is making you suffer so that you won't have time to sin. God knows the future and he knows you're going to sin, and so he's causing you to suffer now. All of these things were not things that Job needed to hear at that time. He learned that he had fair weather friends. He learned about his supporters when he suffered. We learn as well that we might have the wrong kind of friends whenever we suffer. Oh, sure, there's plenty of people when life is going good, and you're able to do things with them. You're able to enjoy life together. We might all have a lot of friends. But when we suffer, even in life's darkest times, that's when we find out who our true friends are. Maybe you've had some bad things happen to you. Things that you didn't deserve, things that you didn't cause, things that were not your fault, and yet bad things happened. Yet trouble came. Were your friends there? Did you have friends that were able to offer comfort in that time? On one occasion, there was a competition that was put on by a local newspaper where they were going to find the child, or they were going to find the person who showed that he or she was the best friend. The one who won was a little girl about 8 years old. Her next door neighbor, an elderly man, had recently lost his wife. And she went next door as he was sitting on the front porch, and she went and sat next to him. And afterwards they said, well, what did you tell him? What did you do? What did you say to comfort this man? She said, nothing. I sat next to him and I helped him cry. Sometimes when bad things happen, that's what we need. And if I'm going through that, that might be what I need. And if your friends are going through that, that's what they need as well. We don't have magic words. We don't have the answers to everything, but sometimes we can help someone cry. Whenever we suffer, we learn about our supporters. A French writer once said, rare is true love, but even rarer is true friendship. Proverbs 17, verse 7, a friend loves at all times. Not the good times, but all times. That's a true friend. Someone has said that false friends are like shadows. They're close in the light, but they leave the instant we walk into the shade. Job learned about his supporters. He learned he did not have good friends. Job, you've sinned. You deserve this. You need to repent. You need to ask for forgiveness because all of this is brought on yourself because of you. Whoever perished being innocent, Eliphaz said. When we suffer, we learn about our supporters. We need to endure suffering because we learn about our friends. Secondly, whenever we suffer, as Job did, he learned about his spouse. I've mentioned her because he loses his children, all of his wealth, and all of these other things. I haven't mentioned his wife, but you recall, you know that she was difficult as well. And certainly we can understand why. Job learned about his spouse here because he suffered. She probably, up to this point, had been a very supportive wife, thankful that he had such abundant wealth, thankful for the children that they had, and the marriage that they had up to that point. But then don't forget, she lost everything as well. She lost all of that wealth. She lost all 10 children in an instant. She watched her husband dwindle and is near the point of death. So what does she do? Well, unlike Job, she had a different outlook on it. She perhaps thought God was doing this to him, as everyone did. And so she told Job simply, curse God and die. Job 2, verse 9. Do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die. Some have suggested that Job was actually being told here, curse God and then commit suicide. Curse God and then end your miserable life because God doesn't want you anymore for whatever reason. And so there's really nothing left for you to do. Death, even at his own hands, was not the answer here for Job. And it's not the answer for us today. But she was down to her last, just same as Job was. And unlike Job, who was going to remain faithful to God no matter what, his spouse said, you need to go ahead and end it. Because that's the only way we're going to get through this. He learned that his wife during this time was a hindrance and not a help. Whenever we suffer, those who are married, we learn about our spouse. And now hopefully we all have a spouse like the one that we need. We have that spouse that's going to be encouraging during those good times and when things get bad. Hopefully we all have spouses, those who are married, who believe in those vows that said we're going to be faithful in sickness and in health, in poorness or riches, whatever the case might be. Job perhaps didn't know what his spouse would do in such a time as this. I dare say that she knew what she would do in such a time as this. But he learned about his spouse whenever he suffered. Endure suffering because you learn about your spouse whenever you suffer. And I say this as someone who's 38 years old and hasn't done a lot of suffering per se in this world. I know there are others who've suffered a great deal. But I would hope that one day if I'm suffering, or I know someone who is going through a lot of pain and problems, that I would be the kind of friend that they would need, that I would be the kind of spouse that she requires. Proverbs 31, of course, the righteous and virtuous woman there, Proverbs 31 and verse 10, that righteous woman, that virtuous woman is a price far above rubies. I dare say that Job would have given all of his riches that he had just lost in order for a spouse who would have been supportive of him when he was suffering. Proverbs 31 verse 12, she will do him, her husband, good and not evil all her days. Job, you're suffering and you're learning about your spouse. He learned that he didn't have the spouse that he needed during that time. More than likely, she understood her mistake at the end. After all, he's given 10 more children. However, during this dark time, she was not the help meet that he needed during this time. A man whose wife has proved herself under adverse conditions should reverence her and be thankful for her. If you've suffered and you've had a spouse that has been by your side, you know that there is nothing better, and frankly, there is nothing you need more than that. Job learned he needed something. He needed more than what he had. And he also learned that he didn't have what he thought he had. Endure suffering. Imitate Job in that we endure suffering. Satan's not attacking us the way that he did Job. This was a special case. But neither is God doing the things to us today. Things happen to us. And when we suffer, when we endure suffering, regardless of what happens, we learn about our supporters, we learn about our spouse. But number 3, we also learn about Satan. There's a lot that we can learn in this book about Satan. We learn, first of all, that Satan is not omnipresent. Satan is not God. He is not everywhere at once. Remember at the beginning, God said, "Where have you been?" Asking for all of those that were listening for their understanding. And Satan said, "I've been in the earth. I've been going up and down, to and fro." See, if he's omnipresent as God is, he's going to have been everywhere at once, but he wasn't. He was going up and down, to and fro. He's not omnipresent. He's not God. Because Satan is not omnipresent, he didn't truly know Job. He's also not omnipotent. He's not all-powerful. Remember, God told Satan, okay, you know what? He's going to be faithful to me even if you take away all the things that he had. Do everything to his things, just don't touch Job. And Satan never touched him during that time. Why? Because he couldn't. He was not all-powerful. And then he said, well, it's because he has that health. If you would ever make him sick, make him on the brink of death, then he would curse you. And God said, okay, fine. You are allowed to touch Job, just don't kill him. And Satan did everything he could, took him up to the line of death, but would never cross over that line. Why? Because he can't. See, he's not omnipresent. He's not all-powerful. He's not omnipotent. God limited Satan. And so Satan is functioning under God. He's not deity. Satan is also not omniscient. He doesn't know everything. Remember, Satan came to God and said, I know why Job is faithful. I know why. That's because you've built a protective hedge around him. And if you'll remove that hedge, if you will take away his health, then he'll curse you to the face. You see, we can go to the end of the book and see that Job didn't do that thing, even whenever all of that was taken away. So I know that Satan doesn't know everything. He doesn't know the end from the beginning. God did. God knew that Job was going to be the one who was going to endure. That's why he suggested, have you seen my servant Job? Satan, we learn from this book, is not omnipresent. He's not omnipotent. He's not omniscient. But he also knew who Job was. And that's an interesting point, I think. Job was known by Satan. God said, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan knew everything he could about Job. He didn't know the future clearly, but he knew something about Job. When I suffer today, I also need to keep in mind some things about Satan. While he's not doing these things to me, whatever it is that people might be suffering, he's not causing them directly. Sin might be the cause or indirect cause of some suffering, but he's not doing it the same way he did to Job. But even today, Satan is not omnipresent. He's not everywhere. God is, but Satan's not. He's not omnipotent. He's not all powerful. He can't do those things. He can't do anything without God allowing him to do that. And even today, Satan's been bound to the point that he's not working in the same way that he has in the past. God has already proven that Satan is beneath him, and therefore Satan doesn't even operate in that way today. I also know today that Satan is not omniscient. I might hear him speaking. I might hear him in my own voice and saying, you know what, I'm too weak. God's never going to love me. You don't know what I've done. You don't know what I've been through. I deserve the problems that I have. That's kind of like him echoing there in my mind. But you know, Satan doesn't know the end. He doesn't know what our choices are going to be. He can guess, but he doesn't know. Prove him wrong in suffering. Be like Job and endure suffering no matter what, and prove Satan wrong, because he would want nothing more than for you to take your suffering and use that as an excuse to blame God. If this is what life is going to be, then I do not need God. That's what he wants. That's what he thinks you're going to say. But we know that Satan is not omniscient. But like Job, does Satan know who you are? It's an interesting question, I think, because, you know, if someone is lost, if someone is living in sin, Satan doesn't know who they are. In Acts 19, verse 15, we read about the 7 sons of Sceva who were trying to cast out demons, and they weren't Christians. They had not obeyed the gospel. They were trying to do it on their own. And they tried to cast out demons on this one occasion. And the demons speaking through the person said, you know, Peter I know, and Paul, and you know, the John I know those apostles. Who are you? Satan didn't even know who these people were because he had them in the palm of his hand. Oh, he knew who Paul was. He knew who John and Peter and the apostles were. He knows Christians. He knew Job. Does he know you today? If you're living in sin, Satan doesn't know who you are, doesn't care about you. But if you're not his, if you're God's people, you better believe he knows your name. You better believe that he's looking for any opportunity to cause you suffering in the way that he can today. And he's certainly looking to tempt you and to draw you away from God. Endure suffering, because we learn about Satan when we suffer. He's not all powerful. And one day we're not going to be suffering. And he is. Learn something from suffering. Job did, and we can as well. Job learned about his supporters. He learned about his spouse. He learned about Satan. And number 4, he learned about himself. You know, there's something that we learn about ourselves that can only be learned when we go through hard times. Testing is essential for just about everything that we take for granted in life. The Air Force and other parts of our military cannot issue weapons or vehicles or other things without first testing them. Have no idea if they're going to function properly without putting them through rigorous tests, almost destroying the vehicle or the weapon they're trying to test to see where its limit is. Testing is essential. I can't be certain of how something will work until it's actually tested. Peter swore he was not going to deny Jesus, promised himself and his Lord that he was never going to deny him. Matthew 26, verse 33. And yet, in the same chapter, when he was tested, he denied him 3 times. You know, we can say, oh, I love Jesus, and we can sing songs about how close we are to him. But until I'm actually tested, and that's one of the things that suffering does, until I'm tested, I don't really know how close I am to him. Am I going to be faithful to him when I'm blessed? Sure, absolutely. What about when trouble comes? What about when dark times come? What about when suffering comes? I learn about who I am, and I learn what I'm made of whenever problems come. Romans 5, verse 3, Paul said, therefore we glory in tribulation. Here's a part where we differ from the world, because the world says any kind of pain, suffering needs to be alleviated, and it certainly doesn't have a place in our lives. The Christian says, sure, I'll try to fix the problem and the pain, but I'm going to glory in problems and tribulation. I'm going to look at that as something that I get to do because I get to show the world this is how a Christian suffers. Therefore, we glory in tribulation, Paul said, because that tribulation works patience. It works endurance. I can be like Job in a way. I can learn about what I'm made of and the kind of person that I am. James 1, In verse 12, blessed is the man that endures temptation. That word temptation doesn't just mean temptation to sin. It means trials, tribulations, problems, suffering. Blessed is the man that endures temptation, for when he is tried, he will come forth as gold. Sometimes we have to have those impurities burned off. And we do that through suffering. I learned what's really important in life. Whenever you're suffering, you learn very quickly money's not important. Whenever you're suffering, you realize those hobbies that you took so much time to do, they're really not what's important. Family's important. Our lives are important. Our God is important. Relationships with other people, Christians included, that's more important. I also learn about myself whenever I suffer. Job certainly learned through suffering. He learned that during his trials, a decision needed to be made. Am I going to let my suffering destroy me? Or am I going to let it make better of me? Am I going to be better because of the suffering, or am I going to be worse? The choice is mine. Someone has well said that suffering can do one of three things. It can make us better, it can make us bitter, or it can make us say, why bother? Doesn't matter, I'm simply giving up. Or I can be made bitter and turn and point fingers at whoever it is that's causing it, including God himself. Or I can say, you know what, no matter what happens, I'm going to be better. I'm going to endure whatever suffering comes my way. Whether it's my fault, someone else's fault, or no one's fault, I can endure. Because God's not going to give me anything. He's not going to let anything come on me that I can't handle. And I'm going to be like Job in the best way that I can. Job learned through suffering. Listen to what he said, what decision he made. Job 13, verse 15, one of the most powerful verses in this entire book. Job 13, verse 15, Job said, though he, God, slay me, yet will I trust in him, but I will maintain my own ways before him. His friend said, Job, you're a terrible sinner, and God is doing this to you because you've sinned. What would people in the world say today? People in the world would say, well, if this is what your God does, if suffering and allowing suffering, if that's who God is, then I don't want anything to do with that God. Job looked at it and said, I don't care what God is doing. If God even kills me, I'm still going to trust him. He didn't even know it at that time, but it wasn't God who was doing that. We're not even told at the end of the book that Job ever learned who it was that was actually doing that. God never tells him, as far as we know. But really, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter, Job, because Job had already made the decision, even if God is doing this to me and goes a little bit further and pushes me over the edge into death, I'm still going to trust him. Many today treat God something to have only during the good times. He's there for a little time, and then when the bad times come, then when the dark clouds cover, then we push him away. Because God, if this is what you're going to do to me, I don't want anything to do with you. Job said, even though he kills me, I'm still going to maintain my trust in him. Job 23, verse 10, again, another powerful verse. Job said, but he knows the way that I take, and when he has tried me, I will come forth as gold. What a great attitude to have. This was not a decision that Job made today about what he was going to do during suffering. I dare say Job had always had that attitude. He had always made that decision that no matter what happens, good or bad, I'm going to maintain my ways before him. And if and when I'm tried, I'm going to come forth as gold. I'm not going to melt away. I'm not going to be weakened. I'm going to glory in my tribulations, because when I am weak, as Paul said, that's when I'm strong. Job understood that, and he learned about himself when he suffered. One final one, so we have a few minutes left. Job not only learned about his supporters and his spouse, he not only learned about Satan and himself, but number 5, Job learned about his sovereign. Who's the greatest sufferer in the book of Job? We might look at Job or his wife and say, well, those two have got to be the greatest sufferers. They suffered tremendously, Job, and all of his loss of wealth and health, his friends, his wife, everything. Job's got to be the greatest sufferer in the book of Job. If Job is maybe the second, Because the greatest sufferer in the book of Job is God. Because God had to sit there with his hands tied and watch as his faithful one suffered. And he couldn't do anything to it, because if he stepped in and saved him from what was happening, Satan would call foul and say, look there, I told you the only reason that he's faithful to you is because you step in and save him all the time. I told you, and I win. So he had to sit there and wait while Job and his friends all thought that he was doing it. You ever had someone say something that's not true about you? There was a lot of that in the book of Job. And so he had to watch as this was happening, and he couldn't do anything about it. Looking at his child that was suffering tremendously, and there was nothing he could do about it, at least in the immediate context. If we go a little bit later, a few thousand years later, there's a man hanging on a cross in between two thieves, and he's suffering tremendously. We might look at that man who was put there because of my sins and yours, and we might think that he is the greatest sufferer on earth at that time. But I think he's second in that context, because there is a God who is standing and watching that event and can't do anything about it. Watching as his son, his child, is suffering tremendously at the hands of his own creation, and he can't do anything about it, because if he reaches down and saves him, then man is lost. Job and all the others are lost if he steps in. And yet, he doesn't. Who's the greatest sufferer in Job? God is. Who's the greatest sufferer at the cross? God was. Who's the greatest sufferer in your life? You might look around and say, well, you don't know all that I've been through. You don't know all the problems that I have and all the difficulties that I have. And that's true, absolutely. But I do know that God is watching the things that we go through and the problems we have and the suffering that we go through and others like us. And there's not really anything that he can do directly. It doesn't work that way today, miraculously. But he watches as we suffer, and he knows there's something better coming. If we will, like Job, endure. Job learned about his king. He learned about his sovereign at the end of this. Job was very concerned about his relationship with God. But God was there for him even in those dark times. And he blessed him in the end greater than he was at the beginning. James 5 verse 11, James says, we count them happy which endure. I have an idea that James was thinking about Job when he was saying that. We count them happy that endure. Get to the other side of that suffering. It may be that suffering is something that we do for a little time here on this earth. I can get through this. I get through this difficult time and endure to the end. It might be that I'm suffering, and it will be the rest of my life. Like Job, he thought that was what he was going to be doing. Get through to the other side, because there is something better coming. We have a king that knows all and sees all and wants the best for us. And while we might look around and say, what is going on? Whose fault is this? He knows that this is something that we are tested by. We're tried by. And he wants us to come through like fine gold, like Job did. Because of his endurance, Job was blessed greater in the end than he was in the beginning. And it was because he endured. When you read Job, if you see anything other than God loves me, you've missed something. Because sure, there are a lot of problems that Job went through. God didn't attack Job, but he doesn't attack us either today. Satan was doing something directly to Job. He doesn't do that today. But we still suffer. And the character of God is still challenged today when we suffer. Am I going to blame him? Or am I going to say, no, I'm going to get through this. I'm going to endure and be an imitator of Job. Perhaps suffering is something that you're experiencing. You might be tempted to leave him because if this is as good as it's going to get, then I don't need him. Let me assure you, he's suffering with you. There's something that only someone who has suffered and been through their darkest days with God, there's only something that that person can learn about God that no one else can. That's when he's there with us. That's when he wants the best for us. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he's there for us. And he still wants to comfort us if we will be but imitators of Job. Thank you so much for your attention tonight. I really appreciate your attendance and appreciate your time with us here this evening.